I hate Sonics. Like, I will never own a Sonic, ever. Like, this car is terrible. You know, it's unsafe, it's slow. And then all of a sudden, like 10 years later, I have one and it's my favorite car that I've ever owned. You just can't beat these small, twisty-turny roads in a little Sonic hatchback. Turbo Tim here with another episode of Road to Horsepower. There are two transmissions in the 1.4, a manual and an auto. Both vastly have different parasitic losses. The manual is like maybe 10, maybe 15% parasitic losses, and the automatic is like an additional like 20 over that. So our number today is gonna be 225 for you auto guys and 260 wheel horsepower for you manual guys. This is wheel horsepower, not crank horsepower. Crank horsepower is a lot more, but ZZP does not have an engine dyno, so I'm not going to claim engine numbers. I'm just going to claim numbers that we see on our eddy current Mustang dyno, which is the more stingy dyno than the more common dyno jets that you may know about. Yeah, one of the biggest lessons with modifying cars, for those of you that maybe aren't familiar with this already, is, you know, an engine is just an air pump. How much air can you get in, and then applying the proper amount of fuel for that air, and then freeing up every restriction that you find. Because every car has restrictions in places, and you have to address each one at a time. Obviously there's some cooling involved as well. So the first mod is going to be cold air intake. It's probably the most popular mod. You know, it adds a lot of fun noises. It frees up the flow, and it usually frees up horsepower, usually cools down the air charge a little bit. Next is going to be the ported intake manifold. Well, the factory intake manifold has walls in it that block the flow. We just port those out, and it's a fairly cheap part from the dealership, so we just start with a new one. And then you gotta get a brand new PCV valve as well, which that's known to fail anyway, so you might as well replace it. You'll gain like 5 to 8 wheel horsepower easily. Then I skip right to turbo. The factory turbo has a ridiculous back pressure ratio. That is holding in a ton of heat. The back pressure ratio on the stock turbo is over 2.6 to 1. And that was just how high our gauge went. So it's probably higher. Like it could be easily upwards of 3 to 1. That's bad. That's holding in a ton of heat. That is a ton of exhaust pressure for your valves to shut through. And obviously it's just restrictive. It's literally like putting a cork in the flow of your air pump. So like one of the biggest upgrades for the 1.4 is a larger turbo. Me, Z04. Z04 spools around, I don't know, let's say 33 to 3,600 RPM. What do you want to do with this car? Do you want a stock feeling turbo that gives you more power, or are you willing to add a little bit of lag? If you're willing to add a little bit of lag to double those gains, then look at our Z04 turbo. I mean, this turbo makes 330 to the wheels on this car like currently, and I mean, this video is not going to date that very well. I'm sure I'll make more on it at some point, but currently it makes 330 wheel on my car. Don't run any turbo that utilizes the stock turbine housing. Like, don't get a big wheel turbo like you'll see on some other websites that is a cartridge that slides in your factory turbo housings. Like, don't do that. Get at least our V3 turbo. Our V3 turbo is a totally new cast turbine housing with a larger scroll, and it will give you 25 to 35 horsepower pretty easily with no sacrificing of lag. I mean, it's a great upgrade. If you want a stock like turbo, then run a V3. Next is going to be intercooler. The more boost you make, the hotter that air is going to be. The hotter that air is going to be, the less dense it is, so you gotta cool it back down. Upgrade the intercooler. You crank the boost up, the higher the boost is, the more the air is being compressed, the hotter the air gets. An intercooler improves the efficiency of the turbo because it lowers the pressure on the outlet side of the turbo. So not only does it cool the air and make cooler, denser charge to make more power, but it makes your turbo more efficient. Cooler air is more power, more dense. You can't tell me that you don't feel the difference on a 40-degree morning versus a 90-degree day. You can't tell me you can't feel that horsepower difference. One intercooler does that. Next is going to be cam and valve springs. You're going to see some gains with a V3, but really the Z04 loves them. So like you definitely want cam and valve springs by the time you're running a Z04 turbo. You'll see maybe 10 horsepower on a V3, but you'll probably see 15 plus on a Z04 car. I mean, everything is a gain of percentage. Next is going to be injectors. You know, we have 42-pound injectors, we've got 60-pound injectors. I don't think you need to go bigger. You're gonna have to run a larger turbo to need more. One nice thing about these cars too is they have an FSCM that you can unlock. You can lower the fuel pressure at idle to make your 60-pound injector smaller, and you can crank your fuel pressure up to make those 60s larger at full throttle. Or if you have the 42s and you're almost maxed, just crank that fuel pressure up and you can push those 42s even further. If you do not have the ability to run E85, then I would just get the green 42s. A nice budget injector, more than enough for a V3 turbo on gasoline, and most Z04 cars. If you want to run E85, I would just skip right to the 60s. With the 60s, you know, we might have to unlock the FSCM, but ZZP charges like 50 bucks to do that, plus an HP tuner credit, so it's super cheap. So we've talked about cold air intake, we've talked about ported intake manifold, we've talked about intercooler, we've talked about the turbo. Now we're gonna talk about exhaust. You can only make as much power as you can flow, and you've got to keep working on removing the next cork and freeing up the flow of the car. So onto the exhaust, you need to know what the future of the car is and like what you're going to do. If you want the car as quiet as possible and you're going to run a stock turbo or maybe a V3, just run the 2.5-inch exhaust. It's still not silent. You're still going to hear it and it still sounds very good, but it's quieter than our 3-inch. However, if you're going to run a Z04 and you're going to run E85 and you're going to want to turn that dial to 10, I would just go right to the 3-inch exhaust. It's a little louder, but it's not going to hold you back like the 2.5 will eventually. I've seen gains going from a 2.5 to a 3-inch exhaust on a full bolt-on Z04 car. Remote tune. I can't stress enough how amazing remote tuning is. Like in the beginning days of ZZP, we're like flashing PCM cores with just a mail order tune and just sending them to people. And it was wild to me, the amount of power people are making on that and just crossing their fingers literally that the tune is dead on. Yes, most of our mail order tunes for the 3800 are very good, but there are so many components of a car that can affect that tune. It's not just the mod list. Every MAF reads a little different. Every map sensor reads a little different. You know, there are a lot of, like every fuel pressure regulator is a little different. There's a lot of little things that can add up to making a mail order tune not optimal. So what we decided with our later model cars is that we just don't offer that. If you want a tune, then we're tuning for your mods, your fuel, your driving style. That means you're going to have a perfect tune in the end. That also means that we can potentially diagnose a problem with your car. It could be anything. You could have a failed PCV system. You could have your air intake tube in backwards to where the MAF is backwards. You can have a O2 sensor that's bad or failing, but like maybe the ECM didn't throw a code for it yet. We can help you diagnose problems with the car to where you have the best running, fastest car possible. And like I previously mentioned, like not everybody's fuels are the same. We're blessed here in Michigan to have amazing premium in E85, in the summer at least. You know, in the winter, you know, obviously there's winter blends that aren't great, but still, even our winter blend fuels are better than some other states. And you know, there are things that people can do. You know, I've seen people buy higher quality fuels and mix them with their pump fuel. I've seen people run octane boost, you know, boostane, you know, stuff like that. There are things you can do to improve your fuel. But remote tuning will help me help you. And finally, what I'd like to talk about is suspension. Yeah, I know I did say road to horsepower in the beginning of this video, but brakes and suspension are they're my favorite thing in this car, so I have to give them an honorable mention in this road to horsepower video. This thing just such an enjoyable car to drive. It's just begging to go fast and turn corners. The cheapest, best way to get performance out of the car would be our ZZP lowering springs with like maybe a set of RS struts and shocks. But honestly, like that's not what I run. I run our ZZP coilovers and I love it. I'm running our off-the-shelf coilovers, which come 6K, 4K, but I swapped the rear springs to 6K, so it's 6K square because I wanted a little bit more oversteer. So between our coilovers and our rear sway bar and then the 6K springs in the rear, like I really enjoy how the car handles. It definitely likes to hit the turns. Our ZZP coilovers gives me the ability to adjust the dampening front to rear. It gives me the ability to change the spring rates front to rear to change the characteristics of the car as I'm entering and exiting a turn. And for brakes, like, I mean, we sell brake upgrades and brake upgrades are great, but I will be honest and say my car for the first 3 years of racing, it was on a stock size rotor. It's just our drilled and slotted rotors, like, and a premium set of brake pads, and it worked great. I just now did a front brake upgrade, and I do like it, I do love it, but I wanted to see how far I could go with the stock brakes first, and I went very far with them. So coilovers, rear sway bar, crucial. Do not forget about your control arms. I have had to replace my control arms twice already. Over the 3 years I've owned it, I've had to replace them twice. That is a wear item. Do not be surprised if you have to replace your control arms once a year. Like you might be able to go 2 years, you might be able to go 3. I'm not nice to my car. I'm not nice to it at all. When it comes to throwing it into a corner, like I'm hard on control arms. Our ZZP control arms, cure the tubular ones, cure that problem. But I do have to mention, they do add some road noise in the car. And at the time, it was more road noise than I personally wanted to deal with. But I'm kind of old and I like my cars as quiet and smooth as possible. Like I don't run every solid engine and trans mount that we sell. I run just a couple, just enough to keep it stiff, but then not add too much vibration. Most of you guys though, like we sell the heck out of all the mounts, and there are a lot of people that run every mount. And the stiffer the engine is attached to the chassis, is less parasitic losses you have, less chances of having wheel hop and stuff. The car will perform better the stiffer everything is. Your car will perform better with our tubular arms than the stamped steel OEM ones that I run. It will perform better with every engine and trans mount where I only have a few of each. I remember years ago, like we're talking, man, when we bought our 2012 Sonic, I mean, our drag Sonic's not even an RS, it's just an LTZ if I recall. And Steve and I were cruising and we were trying to hang with all the Cobalt guys, you know. It was rather embarrassing. You know, the Cobalts are just, they were so fast at the time, but we were already selling parts for them for many years. So I mean, we already had a pretty refined recipe on the Cobalt. And Steve and I are just mashing. We're doing like, you know, 90, maybe 95 miles an hour, and like it felt unsafe. The car was like kind of, you know, floating around. Yeah, it was working hard to get there too. Like we were struggling. And then like, and I'm like, I hate Sonics. Like I will never own a Sonic ever. Like this car is terrible. You know, it's unsafe. It's slow. And then all of a sudden, like 10 years later, I have one and it's my favorite car that I've ever owned. I love this thing. I jump in it, I zip around. It just zips around in and out of traffic. It accelerates very well. It gets remarkable gas mileage. The driver input is just, it's so enjoyable. The brakes work great. The transmission shifts great. The clutch feels good. It makes great power. It's such a fun car. I hope this video helps you guys fall in love with your car as much as I love mine. The car is definitely the best miles per gallon, miles per dollar car I've ever owned. Let us know if you guys want to see more of a max effort 1.4 liter Sonic video, and we can put that together. Turbo Tim, ZZPerformance.